The glass screamed as it cracked, and Jungkook woke to the sound with his heart already sprinting ahead of his thoughts. A shadow moved beyond the living room doors, tall and trembling, its breath fogging the night air as fingers pressed desperately against the frame, testing for weakness. The security alarm had not yet finished its first metallic wail when Jungkook rolled from the bed, bare feet hitting the cold floor, pulse thundering in his ears. The house smelled of rain and metal, of ozone from the electrified fence outside, and of something else, fear, sharp and unmistakable. "Stop," he said, his voice low but steady, more command than plea. The shadow froze. For a second the world held its breath, then the figure lunged, the impact rattled the reinforced glass, spiderweb cracks blooming outward like white lightning. Jungkook stepped back, muscles coiled, mind cutting through panic with practiced focus. Years on stage had taught him how to breathe under pressure, how to keep his face calm when thousands of eyes watched. This was different. This was private. This was his home. He hit the panic switch embedded beneath the kitchen counter. Somewhere deep in the walls, systems awakened, locks sliding, cameras rotating, a silent alert racing toward a security team that knew the route by heart. Outside, the figure began to cry, not the sound Jungkook expected. Not rage. Not triumph that it was broken, hoarse, desperate. "I just want to see you," the man sobbed in accented English, forehead pressed to the glass. "I came so far." Jungkook's chest tightened. He stayed where he was, hands visible, every sense on edge. He could see the man clearly now, soaked hair plastered to his skull, eyes red and shining, clothes clinging like a second skin. There was a smell of damp earth when the man exhaled, of travel and exhaustion. "How did you get in?" Jungkook asked. The man laughed weakly, a sound halfway to hysteria. "I learned. I watched. I waited." The words crawled under Jungkook's skin. This wasn't the first time. Over the past months there had been signs, scratches near the back gate, footprints where there shouldn't have been any, a camera briefly knocked offline and then mysteriously restored. Jungkook had told himself it was coincidence, overwork, the price of paranoia that fame demanded. Tonight stripped those excuses bare. Sirens cut through the rain. Red and blue light washed over the walls, turning the man's face into a mask of terror and relief all at once. He sank to his knees just as security and police swarmed the property, hands pulling him back, voices barking orders in Korean. As they dragged him away, he twisted his head, eyes locking onto Jungkook with an intensity that made his stomach drop. "I crossed an ocean for you," the man whispered. "I had to." Silence returned too quickly after they were gone. Jungkook stood alone in the wreckage of the moment, staring at the cracked glass, his reflection fractured into a dozen versions of himself. His hands shook now that there was no one left to see it. He pressed his palms together, grounding himself in the familiar pressure. Later, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent and wood smoke, he listened as an officer explained the details. The man was Brazilian. He had been tracked entering the country weeks earlier, moving between cheap motels, spending long hours near the property. Letters had been found in his bag, pages and pages written in careful, looping handwriting, filled with devotion, resentment, and a strange sense of entitlement. "He believes you saved his life," the officer said gently. "Through your music." Jungkook closed his eyes. Music had saved him, too. That was the cruel symmetry of it. The same songs that carried hope across continents could also carry obsession, could blur the line between connection and possession. He wondered how many times the man had stood outside in the dark, listening to the house breathe, imagining a place for himself inside. When dawn came, pale and uncertain, Jungkook walked through the house, touching walls as if reassuring himself they were real. Every creak sounded too loud. Every shadow lingered too long. Yet beneath the fear there was something else, a quiet resolve forming, slow and heavy. He would not let this define him. He sat at the piano as the sun rose, fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment he couldn't play. Then a melody surfaced, hesitant but honest, shaped by the night's terror and the strange sorrow of the man who had crossed an ocean chasing a dream that was never his to claim. Outside, workers began to replace the glass. Inside, Jungkook breathed, played, and let the sound remind him of the boundary between the stage and the self, between love freely given and love that turns dangerous when it forgets to let go. By the time the first clear note rang through the room, he knew this night would follow him for a long time. but it would not own him. The interrogation room smelled of disinfectant and cold coffee, and Jungkook hated how familiar that smell had become in his imagination even though this was his first time sitting across from it in reality. The Brazilian man sat behind the glass, wrists cuffed, shoulders hunched forward as if he were trying to make himself smaller. His name, Jungkook had been told, was Lucas. The name echoed strangely in Jungkook's head, ordinary and harmless, nothing like the fear it had carried the night before. "You don't have to be here," the officer murmured beside him. "I know," Jungkook replied, eyes fixed on the man behind the glass. "But I want to hear it from him." The officer hesitated, then nodded. A button was pressed. The door opened. Lucas lifted his head the moment Jungkook entered, eyes widening as if the world had suddenly sharpened into focus. His breath caught, and for a second he looked less like a criminal and more like someone who had just seen a ghost. "It's really you," Lucas whispered. Jungkook stayed standing. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't sit. He crossed his arms slowly, grounding himself in the tension of his own body. "You broke into my house," Jungkook said calmly. "More than once." Lucas flinched. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "That doesn't answer what you did." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Lucas's fingers trembled against the metal table. "I needed you to see me," Lucas said finally, his voice cracking. "I wrote letters. I sent messages. I waited. You never answered." Jungkook let out a short, humorless breath. "Do you know how many letters I receive?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "So I should just disappear? Pretend I don't exist?" "You were never invisible," Jungkook shot back, the edge in his voice surprising even himself. "But you crossed a line." Lucas's eyes darkened, something volatile flashing beneath the surface. "You sing about saving people. About understanding pain. Was that a lie?" The words hit harder than Jungkook expected. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "My music isn't a promise to belong to you. It's not an invitation to my life." Lucas laughed sharply. "Easy for you to say. You have everything." Jungkook straightened. "You think money or fame protects me from fear? From nights like last night?" Lucas's laughter died. His face crumpled, anger dissolving into something raw and exposed. "I lost my brother," he said quietly. "Your song was playing when it happened. I held onto it like a lifeline. You were the only thing that didn't disappear." The room seemed to shrink. Jungkook swallowed, memories rising uninvited of his own darkest moments, of nights when the stage lights felt like a mask rather than a shield. For a brief, dangerous second, empathy softened his guard, but then he remembered the shattered glass. "The shadow at his door." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jungkook said, voice low. "But pain doesn't give you permission to terrify someone else." Lucas's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to be close. To know you were real." "I am real," Jungkook replied. "And that's why this is wrong." The officer cleared his throat softly, a reminder of the boundary Jungkook could not cross even emotionally. Jungkook nodded and stepped back. As he turned to leave, Lucas spoke again, desperation flooding his voice. "Will you forget me?" Jungkook paused at the door. He didn't look back. "I won't forget," he said. "But I won't carry you with me either." Outside, the sky hung low and gray, the city humming with a life that felt oddly distant. Jungkook sat in the car for a long time before asking the driver to move. His reflection in the window looked tired, older than it had the day before. Back home, the house felt different. Safer, maybe, but also exposed, like a wound carefully stitched but still tender. Security had doubled. Cameras blinked quietly, watching corners that had once been shadows. That night, Jungkook met with his team. Voices overlapped, arguments flared, emotions ran high. "This will get out," a manager said. "People will talk." "They always do," Jungkook replied. "We can control the narrative," another voice insisted. Jungkook shook his head. "This isn't a story to polish. It's a boundary to protect." When the room finally emptied, he stood alone in the quiet, listening to the faint buzz of electricity in the walls. Fear lingered, but it no longer dominated the space. In its place was a heavier awareness, a clearer understanding of the invisible threads that connected him to millions, and how dangerous those threads could become when twisted. He sat down with a notebook, pen hovering before the page. Words came slowly, painfully honest. Not lyrics meant to comfort, but ones meant to clarify, to draw lines without cruelty. By morning, exhaustion weighed on him, yet something inside felt steadier. He knew the world would continue to blur admiration and entitlement. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced that confusion, but as sunlight crept through the windows and touched the repaired glass, Jungkook stood and breathed deeply, choosing once again to exist not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as a human being who deserved safety, distance, and the right to say no. The press conference room pulsed with low murmurs and camera shutters, but Jungkook heard none of it as he stepped forward. What he felt instead was the weight of silence pressing against his chest, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. He adjusted the microphone once, a small, deliberate movement, then looked up. "I want to speak as myself today," he said. The room stilled, not as an idol, not as an image. As himself, the story had already leaked, twisted, exaggerated, weaponized. Headlines screamed obsession and danger, others whispered sympathy for the man who had crossed half the world chasing a voice that once kept him alive. Fans were divided, arguing across screens and time zones, some furious, some heartbroken, some uncomfortably silent. Jungkook didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize the fear. He spoke plainly. "Music can connect us," he continued, "but connection doesn't mean access. Admiration doesn't mean ownership. And pain, no matter how deep, does not excuse crossing someone else's safety." A reporter leaned forward. "Do you feel responsible for what happened?" The question landed like a blade. Jungkook paused, then nodded once. "I feel responsible, to be honest. Not to carry guilt that isn't mine, but to acknowledge the power of what I do. And to set boundaries clearly." Another voice cut in. "Do you forgive him?" Jungkook exhaled slowly. "Forgiveness is personal. Accountability is necessary. Both can exist, but they are not the same thing." The room went quiet again, heavier this time. When it was over, when the lights dimmed and the doors closed behind him, Jungkook felt something he hadn't expected: relief. Not because the story was finished, but because he had stopped running from it. Weeks passed. Lucas was sentenced. Psychological evaluations revealed fractures that had long gone untreated, grief that had fermented into fixation. Jungkook read the report once, then folded it carefully and put it away. He didn't need to revisit the details to understand the truth. This was a tragedy built from unmet needs, amplified by distance and illusion. At home, life resumed cautiously. Jungkook relearned the quiet. He cooked again. He left windows open. He let friends sit on the floor with him, talking about nothing important and everything at once. One evening, alone in the studio, he finished the song he had started the night of the break. It wasn't gentle. It didn't beg for understanding. It was honest. The melody carried tension, release, and a final note that didn't resolve neatly, because some things never do. He titled it simply, "Between Us." When it was released, listeners argued about its meaning. Some heard sorrow. Some heard warning. Some heard strength. All of them were right. Months later, Jungkook stood on stage again, lights blazing, crowd roaring like an ocean. For a fleeting moment, the old fear flickered, the memory of glass cracking, of breath against a door that should never have been touched. Then he grounded himself. This was the distance he chose. This was the connection he offered. As the final song ended, he bowed deeply, not to the crowd alone, but to himself, to the part of him that had endured fear without becoming smaller, that had faced obsession without surrendering compassion, that had learned the hardest lesson of all: love must never erase consent, and safety, once reclaimed, is a quiet kind of freedom.